very good afternoon. I know I said last week was special, but this week is extra special. We have, somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, and somebody who's come all the way from America and has settled briefly in Zimbabwe, and is the US ambassador to Zimbabwe, Pamela Tremont. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you so much for
looking forward to this. You know how long it took just to get here?
Yeah, it's been months. It's been, in fact, since we started, actually, we've been trying to get a...
Yeah. Does this mean this is just how busy you are?
I have a very full dance card, yes. No, I mean, there's a lot on our plate at the U.S. Embassy, lots of interest, lots of things we're working on. So, yes, we do have to spread these things out somewhat.
I can imagine. Well, we need to put our best foot forward. So today we're actually going to I made a concoction. And I used to think it was a Zimbabwean thing, but it turns out when we were in Nairobi, they called it a dawa.
Okay.
Dawa, right?
Yeah,
dawa in Nairobi and many other places. It's a concoction. It's ginger, lemon, and then this pamujanje honey, natural honey. And then we've got just some cinnamon just to give it a bit of flavor.
Sounds
I hope
great.
you like it. And then...
Yeah, Tinashe's gone out of his way because usually that is the boring side of the bar, where the teetotalers sit, and the more interesting drink is naturally on this end. But I must say, it's looking very colourful and interesting and full of flavour over there, which is rare. So you should count yourself quite lucky. I picked this up on my way back from comrades at the airport. One of my favourites, La Frog. Very peaty whiskey.
If you need more honey, you can just put honey.
Did you run Comrades?
Yes, I did.
Was it uphill or downhill this year?
It was down.
And how'd you do? You survived it?
I enjoyed the first half, and then I suffered between 45 and 70 Ks. That was just painful.
Yep.
And then after that, I got a second wind, and I enjoyed the second half of it. I missed all of my... the times I aspired to achieve, but I finished and I got a medal and I was quite relieved and thankful.
Well, this was your fifth one, right?
Yeah, it's my fifth one. So I'm halfway to getting a green number.
Wow, that's impressive. I did one ultra marathon about 10 years ago, 80 kilometers, the JFK 50 in Washington, D.C. That was enough. I was one and done.
Well, that's a lot. So what do you do now? How do you exercise?
Well, because of the full dance card, I don't run as much as I used to. The long runs are a bit hard for me to get around to these days. But yeah, I like to run and play ultimate frisbee with my family and ski, scuba dive, things like that.
Oh, fantastic!
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, that sounds like.
And what else do you do when you're in Harare?
Working.
Okay, besides working.
We walk our dog. We travel. We keep up with friends.
Is it a she or a he?
It's a he.
Okay, what's his name?
His name is Bonzo. He is
Bonzo as in the Shona name Bonzo. Or...
That's right.
Oh, really? Bone.
Yes, exactly. That's a complete coincidence.
Really?
Yeah. He's 12 years old. He came from
nice.
America, Golden Doodle.
Oh, nice.
When we take him to Mukavisi, most people want pictures with our dog instead of, there's giraffes right there.
Yeah.
So.
Well, he is an animal, after all. And what do you like about Zimbabwe so far?
The natural beauty is just stunning. I mean, that's just something that I find unmatched almost anywhere in the world. I've been to Bulawayo and Great Zimbabwe and Chimanimani, all the way up to Mana Pools and Lake Kariba, Vic Falls, of course. And the natural beauty is just really something it's hard to find anywhere else in the world,
And which one is your favorite?
Out of all of those, well, I do like the mountains of the Eastern Highlands for sure. But Lake Kariba is gorgeous. Mana Pools.
The sunsets.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even here in Harare, I mean, the suburbs are gorgeous. It's green this time of year. The plant life and animals are amazing.
That's true. And I hear you brought us some gifts.
I did. Although you've already poured your drink. This is a sort of iconic American spirit, Jack Daniels, created by, wait for it, a guy named Jack Daniels. in Tennessee in the 1860s, and they have been making this Tennessee whiskey, this number 7, old number 7, for that long, 150 years or so. 160 years, I guess it is. And they make it there particularly because the water goes through limestone, and the minerals that come through the limestone give it a unique flavor. So add it to your considerable selection here, and I hope you enjoy it.
I appreciate it. I'm a big fan of American whiskey. You guys do things differently over there, including the spelling of the word whiskey. You add an E. The Brits and the Irish don't. Well, and the Irish actually also spell it with an E. The Scotch whiskey is not spelled with an E.
I had not noticed that.
One of the fun facts about Jack Daniel's that I love is that it's not actually a bourbon. They don't, because you're not allowed to affect the flavor of the spirit in any way after you distill it, but they push it through like a maple charcoal. They filter it through some maple charcoal, and that actually makes it smoother and imparts some flavor to it. So technically, it's not a bourbon. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's good. For sure. Thank you so much.
Hope you
Thank you
enjoy
very
it.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah.
very much. And for us mere mortals,
Yes, exactly.
The teetotalers.
For the teetotalers. Some U.S. Embassy swag for you, so you don't forget me the moment I walk out the door.
oh, fantastic.
Awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. Ranga, I now have a pen, and this is lovely. No, thank you so much. We love
pleasure.
keys, always.
You can write down my answers in there and call me out when I get something wrong.
We'll try. Thank you so much for this, and doing this. We've got a number of questions, and our audience have been bugging us with a number of questions. So we'll just get right into it.
All right.
And the first one really has to do with sanctions, because this is a word that we learned, close to 23 years ago now. We didn't know that there were sanctions. Well, by we mean post-independence, but we've had sanctions before, pre-independence. And then, so ZDERA remains in place, and 11 individuals and entities, and 3 entities are on the Magnitsky sanctions list. After 24 years of sanctions, please tell us what has worked and what hasn't worked.
First of all, I would say the sanctions have been very effective in articulating our values against corruption and human rights abuses that we think are holding Zimbabwe back and depriving the Zimbabwean people of the benefits of the amazing resources that you have here in this country. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, is it prevents U.S. institutions, U.S. financial institutions, from being complicit in laundering the money that comes from corruption and human rights abuses. We have the sovereign right to regulate our banks, just like Zimbabwe does and any other country around the world. So this is an effort on our part to prevent financial institutions from being complicit in those sorts of crimes.
But Zimbabwe is hardly the most corrupt nation in the world. And one would argue that when ZDERA was introduced, it had nothing to do with corruption. It had to do with land invasion.
Well, let's stick with sanctions for a minute. The Global Magnitsky List has over 700 individuals on it and entities from 44 different countries. So it's not a question of Zimbabwe being singled out. 11 individuals out of 700 is almost nothing, right? Okay. So Zimbabwe is no more under sanctions than countries like Turkey and Kenya and India. So, the narrative that Zimbabwe is under sanctions, I think, is really unhelpful, and it spooks investors. And so we really need to try and overcome the urge to paint the country with a broad brush like that. That's unconstructive. Now, ZDERA is a totally different thing, okay? And I understand that a lot of people conflate sanctions and ZDERA. ZDERA is a piece of legislation that governs when we are allowed to vote in favor of concessional financing for Zimbabwe in the IMF and World Bank and the international financial institutions like that. And so actually ZDERA has never been invoked because Zimbabwe hasn't been eligible for concessional financing since it defaulted in 1999, which was several years before ZDERA was passed. So if Zimbabwe paid its arrears, ZDERA might become an issue, but it hasn't been up to now. It would be a completely different story. In that case, the United States would only vote for concessional financing for Zimbabwe if 4 conditions were met. And those are restoration of rule of law, including constitutional rights and property rights, civilian control of the military, free and fair elections or establishing the conditions for that, and transparent, legal, and equitable land reform.
Okay.
So if those 4 things were met, we would, under that legislation, actually be required to vote in favor of concessional financing for Zimbabwe. And those things are all in the government of Zimbabwe's control.
Okay. We'll get into that. I just want to go back again on the sanctions. Are you saying that these 11 individuals and 3 entities are on the sanctions because of corruption?
That's right. The Department of Treasury and OFAC, the office within Treasury that manages this, they put together evidentiary packages in order to include people on our Global Magnitsky list, or GLOMAG as we call it. And these have to be able to withstand a court challenge, which anybody on the list can do. They can appeal their inclusion on the list and take it to court, and Treasury would have to justify the inclusion of that individual or entity. So those evidentiary packages are pretty strong, actually.
But the courts in Zimbabwe have not seen them guilty of anything.
Well, these are by our standards, and these don't affect people in Zimbabwe. They just prevent them from using our banks, and we're regulating our banks through this means.
And okay, from my perspective, as a capital market player in Zim, there are unintended consequences to some of these policy actions, and one of them is, and you articulated quite well that it affects these 11 entities and individuals in their capacity to transact with U.S. banks. But if I'm trying to raise capital for a Zimbabwean business, and I'm having a conversation with somebody sitting in London or New York, and they just do a Google search on Zim, and the word sanctions pops up, right? That's just enough to turn them off and say, because a lot of them have a lot of work on their plate, and they just don't have the bandwidth to get into the weeds of, well, what do the sanctions actually mean? Who do they affect and not affect? When they just see that, word sanctions pop up next to Zimbabwe, we just become, a no-go area for their capital. And I've had many conversations with capital allocators outside Zim where they just say, we're not doing Zim. The end. And I think it's impossible to guess exactly how much money has given Zimbabwe a miss because of the perception that the country's under sanctions. But for sure, it is a big deal in terms of the actual impact of the perception in capital flows into Zimbabwe. So I don't know to what extent, from where you're sitting, that's something that you're concerned about and have committed any resources to try and ameliorate.
Well, there is certainly an issue with overcompliance sometimes, and that's one of the reasons we modernized our sanctions policy towards Zimbabwe last year. We used to have the Zimbabwe individuals on a specific list just for Zimbabwe, and that did give people the impression the country was under sanctions. So we abolished that list. It had 99 people on it or so, and moved 11 of those 99 over to our Global Magnitsky list. That's it. And the modernization means that Zimbabwe isn't treated any more differently than the other 44 countries on the list. So I don't know why companies Google Zimbabwe and sanctions pops up immediately. That's one of the reasons we're urging the government here to stop characterizing Zimbabwe as a sanctioned country, because that narrative is really destructive. But when they Google Turkey, the word sanctions doesn't come up. When they Google India, it doesn't immediately come up as sanctions. So we need to change the narrative about Zimbabwe to prevent this overcompliance that you're talking about. And one of the things that the State Department did and the Department of Treasury last year after our sanctions modernization was call some banks in the U.S. and just make sure they understood that Zimbabwe isn't under sanctions and that they could establish correspondent banking relationships here if they wanted to. And actually, none of them said that sanctions were preventing them from establishing those relationships. It was the compliance costs and the regulatory costs in the small market and the risk reward. And so we continue to answer those questions, and we urge trade between the U.S. and Zimbabwe all the time. You see U.S. products here all the time. I saw it at ZITF and at ADMA last week, the week before. So there is a bit of trade going on, but it does take a certain amount of effort to convince people that Zimbabwe is a worthwhile market.
Okay, let's now get into the weeds of Zidera.
Okay.
So this was
we had already done that, but let's keep doing
it. It's a big issue in Zimbabwe.
Okay.
So that's why we have to raise this.
And also Tinashe is pedantic.
That's true.
And we have that in common.
One of the big issue had to do with compensation of the former white farmers. And we know that government has gone a long way, and it's $3.5 billion will be fully compensated for the improvements on the farms. If I had my way, I would never pay them a cent, similarly with a lot of Zimbabweans, but we do recognize what has happened and that there are justifications for us sorting that out as far as the farmers are concerned. But we haven't seen any movement from the Americans, because Zimbabweans have literally gone out of the way to say, okay, we're going to compensate the white farmers, but the Americans have not come to the party.
Well, I think two things. First of all, the criteria in Zidera is for land reform that is transparent, legal, and equitable. It doesn't require land compensation per se. What it's requiring is that there be a transparent plan that respects property rights and evens things out a bit, right? So I think that there's some flexibility there that we could talk about. Now, the land reform that the government has done so far, I agree, they've made huge steps, but the GCD is not fully implemented, probably won't be. It's a tremendous amount of money. They're now going towards the PROFCA resolution, and there's a lot of disputes within the farming community about which is the right way to go. So I do think that there have been considerable steps in a difficult budget environment, but I think there's still some ways to go. The problem is land is just one of the 4 criterion, right?
Okay, but is there a way in which the Americans can at least move so that we know that we're doing the right thing?
Move in what way?
Meet the farmers, meet government, and agree to be on the table and agree to be part of that process.
We're part of the process in the AFDB structured dialogue on arrears clearance because, of course, there's 3 pillars to that. One of them is land, one of them is economics, and one of them is governance. And so we're part of the negotiations in the context of the AFDB structured
Last time
dialogue.
you were on pause.
We rejoined earlier this year.
Okay.
We were at the high-level meeting last November, and we've been at all the working-level meetings since
So
then.
you can affirm that you are no longer on pause.
We're no longer on pause.
Okay, all right. Okay, and then we've got a new administration, which is the Trump administration, just looking at sanctions and looking at deal making, because he is a businessman and he has been known to be a deal maker. And we just want to understand, what would an off-ramp for Zimbabwe, because we've been on the news for quite some time, what would get us, maybe not in the Oval Office, but what will get us in the right terms with the Trump administration? What are the advantages of a Trump administration that we would never get with any other administration?
I mean, I think that there's an assumption that under the Trump administration, our foreign policy will be entirely transactional. And Secretary Rubio has disputed that. President Trump has disputed that. Human rights will remain at the core of our foreign policy, so that will remain an issue. And I think that there's some assumption that the White House will be much more interested in Zimbabwe because of the minerals here and so on. That may prove to be the case. It has not been yet. I would urge the government of Zimbabwe to think about what sort of offers we could talk about in order to strengthen that relationship. But at the moment, the bilateral relationship is governed by the 4 criteria of Zidera.
Okay.
Yeah, so
which is a pretty holistic way of looking at it.
I think maybe just to double click on what Tinashe is saying, if you look at the Trump administration's trip to the Middle East and the transactions that were penned with the Arab states, I think it was Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, they were very big deals with nations that are not necessarily the bastions of what we would call Western liberal human rights values. And the sense I got from listening to the speech that he gave in one of those nations is that, the US has stepped away kind of from being, sanctimonious. They will look at a country and respect its history, its heritage, its culture, and focus more on finding ways that the US could interact with the nation on a win-win basis. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is where Zimbabwe's got a unique opportunity because we've got this amazing, rich mineral resource endowment that we have just scratched the surface of extracting in a meaningful way. And I think that from my reading of where the US is today, you're looking at perhaps diversifying where you get a lot of minerals that are essential for your economy to thrive. So is there, my sense is that there is an opportunity for there to be a conversation where we say, look, this is the historical context. We haven't always been the best of friends and got on. But there's this rich mineral resource endowment, and we're interested in doing deals similar to what happened in the Middle East. Is there a conversation to be had there?
That conversation has always been to be had. I know that the government here often views our bilateral relationship in terms of sanctions first, and that is not how we see it. We compartmentalize sanctions on those 11 people and those 5 entities. That's it. Everybody else is free to do business with the U.S., and we've been encouraging that for years now. Since I got here in July, one of my primary efforts has been to work with the government and ZETA and civil society and the private sector, other diplomats, to identify impediments to the investment climate so that we can figure out what is holding our trade back. We have not been the one putting the brakes on the relationship. And there's always a deal to be had. We're quite happy to have any of those discussions.
Okay, that's
very good to hear. Yeah.
So now let's get into the numbers. USA has directly provided about $3.5 billion to Zimbabwe as aid. This is since 1980.
Since independence.
Since independence. And in 2024 alone, USA provided $360 million in aid. One could add more American charity organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It means that there's a lot of funding that is coming through as aid. Could you just maybe give us a bit of color and why the Americans have seen it fit to put in and to pour as much aid into Zimbabwe?
Well, I think it's, first of all, evidence that we have always been a friend to Zimbabwe. Despite the rhetoric that you sometimes hear or the framing of the relationship in sanctions alone, right? And I have to correct your numbers, actually. Those are just USAID numbers, which is the majority of our assistance. Okay. But actually, we've invested about $5 billion in Zimbabwe and in the Zimbabwean people since independence.
So I need to use the pen. Correct.
And $400 million last year alone, and about $1 billion in the last 3 years. And so that's a considerable investment in the future of Zimbabwe and evidence of our commitment here. And that is for everything from last year, for example, 47,000 farmers had better access to markets because of our assistance. 12,000 young people were able to advocate for transparency and integrity in their communities because of our assistance. We have conservation projects that help reduce the human-animal conflict. We have exchange programs. But obviously the biggest and most successful one, I have to say, is PEPFAR and the fight against HIV/AIDS. Because of PEPFAR, the number of people, the infection rate in Zimbabwe is less than half of what it was when we started the program.
The government would attest that it's the 3% tax that they tax us. AIDS levy that they tax us.
I mean, we're spending over $200 million a year on antiretroviral treatment and healthcare strengthening, electronic health records to keep 1.2 million HIV positive people alive. And that's not just humanitarian and life-saving. That allows them to work to feed their families and pay their school fees and participate in the economy, whereas before HIV was threatening to take the whole economy down like a house of cards, right? And so that has been a huge commitment in the future of Zimbabwe and has really opened up some fiscal space for the government to tackle other problems while we handled this. As a result of our assistance, Zimbabwe reached the 95-95-95 goals on testing, treatment, and viral suppression years ahead of schedule. So as we start to reduce our assistance, the government, we hope, will start to step in and pick up some of the burden, because we would not want to see, especially the HIV infection rate, start to climb again.
That's what we're going to talk about.
If will allow me, I just want to get a little bit philosophical about aid, because there's a debate, and this is not necessarily peculiar to Zimbabwe, but just globally, that, does aid do more harm than good? Because I'm an aid skeptic. I as a free market capitalist, I'm of the view that nations should really take responsibility for the outcomes of their people and sort themselves out. And sometimes, especially in poorly governed countries, what aid tends to do is it tends to forgive poor governance and the outrage and problems that a government that's not well run would otherwise have to face, ameliorated by all this aid, because people have they get relief elsewhere, whether it's food aid or healthcare or whatever it is, and the governments then decide that it's not their problem, and they don't actually make a plan to build infrastructure or grow their economies or do the right thing. And so, coming back to Zimbabwe now, we have this scenario where, somebody put US aid through the wood chipper and, all this aid has stopped. And, we're having a conversation now about how we're going to deal with all these issues. So I don't know, just what do you think, philosophically, in terms of just, is it possible that aid does more harm than good?
I mean, I think this is a philosophical debate that people have been having for decades. What I can say is that for 45 years, the American people have been standing by the Zimbabwean people to keep them alive. We fed 1 million food insecure people last year. Would somebody else have provided them food if we hadn't? Possibly, possibly not. I do know 1.2 million people are alive because of the antiretroviral treatment we give them. Now, as Secretary Rubio has said, the most successful aid programs decrease with time, not increase. And so that is a real change in our policy and a real call on all of us to start thinking about a handover of how the government can gradually take up responsibility for a lot of these programs. Our humanitarian and life-saving work continues. Of the $400 million we had budgeted for this year, about $223 million of it are continuing through this fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. I expect that some of that could be reduced in the out years. We're still debating the budget back home, as you may have seen. So we'll see how that goes. But I do know that we've been talking to the Ministry of Health for several years about the sustainability of PEPFAR, with the idea that this cannot go on forever. PEPFAR was the emergency plan for AIDS relief. It's been 20 years plus. It's no longer an emergency, and the Ministry of Health needs to start picking up some of the
So could we get into the details, especially given the cuts in USAID? What does that actually mean for Zimbabwe?
Well, we've been fairly fortunate here that the drop-off hasn't been too steep, too fast. As I said, about $223 million of our assistance continues through this year, which is about 55% of our programs. That's primarily the life-saving and humanitarian assistance. But in the out years, I would expect that to diminish further.
What would that look like? If you're spending $400 million a year, what would that look like in the coming years?
You mean if it continues to reduce?
Yeah, exactly.
We're working with the government and with Washington to determine what more we will be able to continue on next year and what we might have to reduce and hand off.
There's been a lot of gnashing of teeth within the aid sector, and a lot of people were retrenched or laid off. How's that been in Zimbabwe?
Well, I've been surprised. There have been a fair number of people who would not disagree with you and say it's time for donors to stop taking up the responsibility and for us to take care of ourselves. Fully supportive of that. I think it's been a little dramatic for the people, for example, my USAID colleagues at the embassy who found themselves in a very precarious situation very suddenly. And in some cases, there was narratives about their work that I think were not true or helpful and not very fair to people who've spent their lives trying to help the poorest and most disadvantaged people around the world. So there's also a lot of sadness in the community, in the diplomatic community, in the aid community, about how USAID has been treated and talked about in recent months. And I think that we can debate about whether the aid should continue or reduce or increase or whatever, but I think it's fair to say that we should all treat each other with dignity and respect, and that's what we plan to do at our embassy.
Okay, so let's move on from aid, where you've done a fantastic job, but let's contrast that with trade. So the trade between USA and Zim has been falling, and if we start with 1999, total trade was $200 million US. But in 2024, the total trade is almost half of what it was 26 years ago. With everything that you've said and you've explained, why is this contradiction? Why is there this contradiction? Because as far as aid is concerned, it's going up. But as far as actual trade is concerned, it's actually down from what it was 26 years ago.
Well, there is a lot that's gone on in the Zimbabwean economy over the last 26 years that doesn't have anything to do with us. I think you have to admit how many currencies have we been through and hyperinflation.
We lost count.
Yeah. So just macroeconomic instability in general. But yeah, completely agree. Our trade should be better. Our trade should be higher. $112 million last year is tiny compared to the size of our economies. So we need to increase that, which is why when I got here last July, I started working on the investment climate and the issues that we can work on with the government to make Zimbabwe a more attractive destination for U.S. companies and for companies around the world, high quality investment for everyone.
What are the American investor? What are his issues? What problems does he have with Zimbabwe?
Good question. We hear, it's very complicated and tedious to register a business. I was at a meeting last fall and a minister was explaining that his wife was trying to register a restaurant. And she had to go to 30 different offices to get permits and licenses. And if that's a minister's wife, you can imagine how daunting that is for an American investor who, doesn't know Harari from LA, right? And so we want to make registration easier. We're working with Zeta on that. Zeta is a really good partner. The regulatory environment can be very uncertain. The rules change every day, which makes it difficult for investors to plan out their risk and reward. Corruption is obviously an issue. The ZNCC did a survey, and 81% of their members said that corruption was weighing down the business enabling environment. And that's not just for U.S. investors. That's for Zimbabwean entrepreneurs and business people as well, right? It's making their lives difficult. It's raising their cost of doing business. And it's depriving the Zimbabwean people of resources that could be used for health and education and infrastructure. So I brought a little show and tell, actually. I found this report recently, someone shared it with me, from Oxford Economics. It's the Africa Risk Reward Index. Have you seen it?
Yeah. We do a lot of...
It's not very flattering.
Yeah, so you won't be surprised by this graph that shows Zimbabwe, way down here with the highest risk and the lowest reward of any country in Africa. Well, when investors are looking where to put their money, they're looking for the best possibilities where they can make money and prosper. And so we need to change this. And we need to work with the government and other investors to figure out how we can make Zimbabwe a better investment destination for everybody.
We totally agree. When we were in Vic Falls for the Chamber of Mines conference, one of the investors there said, look, it's easier to invest in a war-torn country like DRC than Zimbabwe. And that was really heart-wrenching.
We have a handful of American investors in mining here, and the stories are nightmarish.
Would you like to share?
Well, overpegging is an issue. Property rights are an issue. They can't get a fair hearing in court, because of insider connections and so on. So they spend the money in prospecting, but then they can't actually produce the gold that they came here to produce. There's illegal miners that the police don't do anything about. All sorts of property rights violations that are not upheld. Many of them are trying to sell their assets and try and get out because they just can't make it work. It's really hard for me to recommend to other U.S. investors to come to Zimbabwe when we can't take care of the ones that are already here.
So it has to do with property rights?
Mostly, yes. But also regulatory environment. We're hearing increasing stories of the regulatory agencies really harassing companies and businesses, not just American, but even Zimbabweans are complaining to me about this, harassing them to try and fine them and get penalties out of them as a way of funding their own agencies. That's not great for the business environment either.
Yeah,
no, for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
And these are the stories that we need to hear more of so that it's actually addressed. And something that you have done, I think it was 2 weeks ago, a week ago, where you spoke very strongly against corruption in Zimbabwe and as a great impediment to U.S. investment in Zim. I suppose the way we had looked at this question is the USA still invests quite heavily in other corrupt nations. So why would corruption be? Because we are not the most corrupt nation.
No, certainly not.
Certainly not. So why wouldn't investors still come? I hear the point around policy inconsistency and property rights as an issue. But suppose we were to solve that, would corruption be a big thing? Because that's the thing. That's the hill you, well, I won't say you want to die on, but that's an issue. That's
I'm not looking to die on any hill at the moment.
That's an issue that you've taken a great interest on, which is corruption.
Right.
Why not, policy inconsistency and regulatory issues? But you're focusing on corruption.
But I think corruption underlies so much of that, right? The reason people can't get a fair court ruling is because somebody has inside connections or has paid off the people in charge of the judiciary. The reason the police won't enforce property rights or kick off the illegal miners is because somebody has paid them off. So I think corruption is just part of it, woven in the fabric of all of the problems that we're dealing with here. Are there more corrupt countries? Absolutely. But I'm the ambassador to Zimbabwe, and I'm trying to figure out what the problems are here so we can solve them. Because, again, it's back to risk and reward. Possibly in those other more corrupt countries, the rewards are better, and so it's worth enduring the corruption. But in Zimbabwe, we have what we have, and we need to try and solve those problems.
What are your thoughts on that?
Do you think we get a fair, does the perception of the risk in Zimbabwe, be it corruption, policy inconsistency, and the other challenges, do you think that as a nation we do a good enough job of articulating the potential upside of investments here? Because the sense that I get is that, part of the challenge as well is that there's this gap between the perception of Zimbabwe is that we're under sanctions, corruption is completely out of control, relative to some of these other countries that when I look at them, I think we're much better off. I think we're much more peaceful. I think it's much easier. My sense is it ought to be easier to do business in Zimbabwe, but I think that for whatever reason we get a much worse rap on the global stage than we should. Is that a misconception from a Zimbabwean perspective?
Well, you would have to ask people who have those perceptions, of course. But I do think it is Zimbabwe's responsibility to create the narrative about it and sell Zimbabwe as a country. My responsibility is to sell the U.S. as a country, right? To attract investment to the U.S. and to underscore U.S. values and highlight what America has to offer. So I do think the government of Zimbabwe could do more to sell itself. And, the expectation that I'm supposed to demand U.S. companies come here and invest or force them to do so is just not realistic. No ambassador can't, well, maybe some, but in free market economies, that is not how it works. And so all we can do is make Zimbabwe the most attractive destination it can be, so that when U.S. companies are looking around for where to put their money, they think Zimbabwe looks good compared to everything else, right?
Okay, so on that point, where you're representing American companies, have you gone to our president or to the senior officers in Zimbabwe to make your case about, American investors and the troubles that they're getting in Zimbabwe as far as Zimbabwe is concerned, and what has been the response from the authorities?
Well, if you ask them, they would say, I won't shut up about it. This is all I talk to them about. I mean, we can agree and disagree on a lot of different things, and we do and have. That's what bilateral relationships are about. But the one thing we can agree on is that trade is a win-win situation for both of us if we can increase it. And so we need to talk about those issues, get them on the table, and figure out ways to resolve them.
Okay. Since aid is still, there's still quite a bit of aid coming in. Could you be involved in some sort of anti-corruption or a way in which we can increase investment or, ease of doing business in Zimbabwe? Could the U.S. help us as far as that's concerned?
So I'm going to push back on you, because you guys were just telling me you're aid skeptics and think that we shouldn't be doing aid here.
You said he's
now
an
you're saying you want us to do more on corruption. We had corruption programs, but at the moment our aid has been reduced to just life-saving and humanitarian programs.
Okay, no, fair enough. We're just talking about redirecting the aid.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really important part of it. If it were up to me, that would remain a part of our program, because I think the only way for Zimbabwe to really get on its feet and be the self-sufficient, self-reliant country we all want it to be is to solve these problems. Anybody will tell you that a strong economy is supported by strong democratic institutions that create transparency and accountability, right?
True. Okay, now let's get more into trade. And we saw the USA Liberation Day tariffs. What is likely to happen in the next 90 days? And what's likely, where is Zimbabwe going to be? So first, from a global perspective, what's likely to happen beyond the 90 days? And what should Zimbabwe do?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball. I left it back at the office. But look, the United States has had the most open economy in the world for many years. For many years, we have offered preferential access to our markets that were not reciprocated by other countries. And President Trump has determined that we should level that playing field. And I'll give you an example. He announced an 18% additional tariff on Zimbabwe. But if you tried to import a vehicle from the U.S., which admittedly doesn't happen very much because we drive on the other side of the road, so we don't make them for this side. But in addition to the purchase price, there would be 60% increase in the cost because of tariff and non-tariff barriers. There's, import duties and surcharges and
it's
VAT.
Close to 100%, yeah.
It's crazy high. And so by that standard, even 18% is a pretty generous offer, I think. So I think what President Trump's announcement did was a wake-up call for the world that it was time to level the playing field and make things more reciprocal and fair. Now, President Mnangagwa came in right away with an offer for 0 tariffs on U.S. goods. That offer is good for 90 days, as I understand it. And we've been in discussions with the government of Zimbabwe about what a long-term deal might look like. There's some details that we're still trying to figure out what the offer is. Unfortunately, there's over 100 countries now that are all trying to negotiate these deals in Washington, and trade deals are, as you can imagine, extremely complicated. So I think it's going to take longer than 90 days.
I think for Zimbabwe, what would be of interest to us is how do we get into AGOA? Because in the last 20 years, we've suffered because we haven't been part of AGOA. So now that we are talking about trade, can AGOA be part of those discussions? And AGOA has nothing to do with IMF and the World Bank and
Right.
Zidera. That should really sit on its own. Why can't Zimbabwe be part of AGOA?
Well, there are criteria for joining AGOA because the idea behind it was that we would offer preferential trade access to U.S. markets, but not for countries who are letting children do work for pennies a day, right? So trying to prevent it from being abused in that way. Zimbabwe has not met the criteria for AGOA, but that is definitely something we should talk about in the future. Also, AGOA has not been renewed by the new Congress yet either, so it's not clear that it's going to go forward.
Okay. All right, interesting. Let's talk about foreign policy traditions. Maybe we want to contextualize before we ask the ambassador.
Yeah, we were actually having a chat about it earlier before you came, and we were the whole global diplomatic framework is, came to be, during feudal Europe, relations between kings and queens and diplomatic community and embassies and that sort of thing. And the world has changed so much since then, in terms of the technology that allows us to communicate in certain ways. So for example, during feudal Europe, you actually needed an envoy because it took weeks to get a message from one side of the continent to the other. But today you can actually imagine two presidents on on the opposite side of the world having a conversation. It just seems to me that, especially from a poor country like Zimbabwe's perspective, the US is this superpower and not a poor nation by any stretch of the imagination. You can afford to have an embassy everywhere in the world, but does it make sense for a small poor country like Zimbabwe to reciprocate and have embassies everywhere in the world as well? How do you see things in terms of that global framework of diplomatic relations? Is it still fit for purpose from the circumstances from which it arose?
I mean, it depends on the country, right? Our model for how we do diplomacy is much different than other countries. We have embassies in almost every country in the world. We just opened new embassies during the Biden administration and some of the smaller islands that had closed or had never had embassies before. And we find that that's the only way to be on the ground and really get to know the people and understand exactly what's going on there really well. But of course, not every country has the resources or the manpower that we have. And so Zimbabwe has, a fraction of the number of embassies that we have, and that's probably suitable for its foreign policy goals. But I'm always surprised, having done this for over 30 years myself now, that every country does it slightly differently, and we tend to go big or go home, I guess.
They say everything is bigger in the US, don't they?
And what would you say is the foreign policy doctrine that the current administration subscribes to?
I don't think there's a particular foreign policy doctrine that they're trying to emulate from previous administrations, but the Trump administration has been very clear that our foreign policy will be America first. And that means ensuring that America's interests are front and center of what we do around the world. It shouldn't be too surprising. I would think that every country is doing that. I would hope so. That's what our governments pay us to do, right? And Secretary Rubio said that's not isolationism, that's just common sense. And so the Trump administration has really reminded us that that is the first thing that we need to think about before, as we act overseas, for sure.
Okay. And then when you look at the USA relationship dynamic with BRICS, and particularly with China, and how China has infiltrated into Africa, and in a big way, primarily from an investment and trade perspective. How is the USA reacting to that, and what are we likely to see the relationship between USA, BRICS, and all the other Europe as well?
I think the Trump administration isn't afraid to try new things and to take risks and shake things up. And so President Trump has taken a pretty hard-nosed approach with China, and especially the unreciprocal trade relationship that we've had with China over the years. And so he's willing to work through the things and find the win-win situations and come out on the other end with a more reciprocal trade relationship, something that's a little bit more fair for all of us.
But being more specific to Zimbabwe, if the American investors in the mineral sector are leaving, then all know that that space is going to be filled up by the Chinese?
Well, it's mostly dominated by Chinese companies now, and we can all wonder why that is. But if Zimbabwe wants investors from other countries, and my understanding, every time I meet with government ministers, they are pleading for us to get more U.S. investors here because they want more balance in the type of investments that they're getting. But the environment has to be right to get U.S. companies to come here.
But why is it the Chinese have found the environment amenable?
That's the mysterious question, isn't it? You tell me. Why is it that Chinese companies are not facing the same difficulties?
To put it into context, if we were to resolve the policy inconsistencies and some of the regulatory challenges of doing business in Zim, from just what sense do you have in terms of just a back of the envelope, or just your best guess in terms of if because right now, if you actually look at the government of Zimbabwe, the ruling party controls all the branches, so they could actually make all these changes in short order if they thought that it would be helpful. If they did make those changes to the regulatory environment, to the currency framework, to some of the issues that you've raised that are holding back investment from American companies, potentially what kind of quantum of investment could we actually see come through on the other end of that? Are we talking, $1 billion, $10 billion, $50 billion? Like, from the conversations that you've had, what's realistically achievable? If we were to have a conference, next week, invite American investors and say, look, guys, what are your concerns? And then 30 days later say, right, we've made these changes. What's the next step? What realistically could actually come through in terms of investment into our country?
I'm not really qualified to quantify it in that way. I think that there would be a lot of interest. I think there are factors that impede U.S. investment that don't have anything to do with Zimbabwe, for example. I'll give you one example. Lithium. The price is really low right now. American companies probably couldn't afford to mine it in an economical way. The Chinese can do it because they can afford to mine it at a loss. Their vertically integrated companies make it up on the other end when they sell the batteries. But our companies don't operate that way. So that's sort of a distortion it's not the Chinese fault, it's not our fault, it's not Zimbabwe's fault, it's just the way we operate that makes it difficult for American companies to come into that one specific space.
Sure.
But, there are things, I'm sure there are many companies that would be interested in coming in. In terms of mining in particular, though, like, none of the major mining companies are here anymore except for two who back in the 90s had bilateral investment agreements, because it's just too uncertain to commit that much money to big mining operations. So most of the Western mining companies that are here are pretty small exploratory companies. They do some exploration and then they sell to the Chinese mostly, because that's the environment that we're in right now.
Yeah. Let's look at the US dollar and its supremacy as a world reserve currency. Do you see that sustainable in the long run? And what are the threats that you see? And then, as a segue, what are your thoughts on Zimbabwe using the US dollar?
Well, I don't really have thoughts on Zimbabwe using the dollar. I do think it has stabilized the economic situation here somewhat by allowing people a currency that doesn't fluctuate too much. I do think de-dollarization is going to be a challenge for the government, and obviously we're supportive of them doing that. They should be able to have their own monetary policy. But the dollar is the world reserve currency because we have the strongest, deepest institutions that are transparent and respect property rights, and people gravitate towards the dollar when everything else seems uncertain. The dollar and gold for some reason, right? And so I think the dollar is going to remain strong. Everywhere I go, nobody's denying me the use of the dollar. People seem to be sticking with it at the moment. So I feel pretty certain that it's going to remain the world's reserve currency for some time.
Have you had any discussions with the central bank, our own central bank, pertaining to US dollars and importing US dollars into Zimbabwe? And
not particularly. I mean, we talk about their plan for de-dollarization a little bit because obviously that is a goal that they have for their own economy. They're certainly entitled to that. Not having dollar liquidity is a challenge for the government, so I can completely understand why they would want to de-dollarize a bit.
Okay. And any American companies that are owed money by the RBZ or the Treasury?
Well, there's some bilateral debt that's in arrearance, like other bilateral debts in the arrears process. Mm-hmm. But U.S. companies...
Yeah, private companies.
None that come up to the top of my head at the moment. There are a couple companies that have contracts that have not been observed, things like that. But as far as I know, I don't believe that there's U.S. companies that are owed money by the government.
Okay.
So when you look at Zimbabwe from from an American perspective or from an outsider's perspective, because one of the things that I think we are guilty of as Zimbabweans, because we live and work here, we tend to be inward looking, and so in as much as it makes us to some extent subject matter experts, there's certain things that we have certain blind spots because our capacity to zoom out and look at things like an outsider would is obviously limited. So what are some of the things that perhaps, if you were sitting down advising a Zimbabwean policymaker or business person, what are some of the things that you've observed about the way we do business here that we ought to do differently, that are obvious to you as an outsider?
Well, the things I mentioned before, the regulatory certainty would make the predictability of doing business much easier. Anti-corruption efforts, I think, would make things much easier for business people here. Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of normal things that everybody is looking for in a business enabling environment, right? That lowers the cost of doing business. It's not.
I suppose Zimbabwe should just be normal.
If you could arrange that, that'd be great.
So, Adesina has left. We now have a new president, and this is the last question. Do you think that there will be someone who will take over the mantle with as much passion as he had? And, the debt arrears clearance, that had been going on for like 4 years. So I think that without him, I think, it's going to be very difficult. What are your reading the room, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think that we could perhaps fast track that arrangement with our creditors?
Well, we're very supportive of the AFDB-led process, obviously. It's really important that Zimbabwe get out from under this unsustainable debt load that it has. It's paying way too many resources on servicing these debts. So we would be very supportive of clearing those arrears. The program of action is laid out. These are the reforms that the government proposed and that the government agreed to, and the AFDB has just been sort of convening the parties to get it there. There's still some work to be done. There's a lot of movement happening in land reform, as you mentioned earlier. The IMF is here this week, I think through today, talking about the economic plan and the staff monitored program that they're trying to come to an agreement on. That would get the economic pillar of the talks quite far, actually. The problem is the governance track, where the indicators by which the government reforms are being measured are in many cases backtracking a bit. And so we're working with the government and the AFDB and the parties, President Chisano's team, to see how we can move those forward. But all of the reforms that are necessary in the governance track are completely in the government's hands. All we can do is be supportive.
Okay. All right. On that note, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Very, very, very useful for us and very useful for our audience. We've learned a lot. I think what I've learned is we need to be normal.
We all strive to be more normal.
We need to get back to bookish economics.
Bookish economics, maybe that will get us going. But I think that these conversations are very important because we learn exactly how the world looks at us and what we need to do to get investments, because I think that's the big thing that we need to do is to get as much investment in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much, our audience and everybody at home. Please continue to like, to subscribe, and to share. And let us know in the comment section what you guys think. Otherwise, have yourself a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.